Acts chapter 18. Message that I've titled this morning is Exactly as God Planned. Exactly as God planned. We, of course, are continuing with Paul and Silas and the others on their second missionary journey. He just left Athens, and here we pick up Paul in the beginning of Acts 18 as he heads to Corinth. And we're going to some of the very particular things that God put together in Paul's life and in his ministry at this time that kind of made it all come together as one. You know, I am a product, or I grew up mostly in the 70s and 80s. Now, some of you predate that, some of you postdate that, and that's fine. But whenever I think of my years growing up, one of the there were a number of new things that came. You know, we had video cassette players. That was a big thing, right? Microwave ovens. I remember when we first got our first microwave oven. And you think, well, how would you not have one? Well, we didn't have one back then. And it was a big deal because now you could take a stale donut and put it in for 9 seconds and heat it up, and you were good to go, right? Never could do that before. That was a new amazing thing. The other thing that I remember came out was a Rubik's Cube. I think that came out in the late 70s, early 80s. And if you remember the Rubik's Cube, it was simply a cube. It was a very simple thing, right? Every face of the cube had a different color, and there were 9 different little, boxes on the cube that you had to line up so that all the colors on each face were the same color when you were done. Now, when it came in the package, it was all solved, right? It was called solved. It was ready to go. But as soon as you started messing it up, right, you started rotating the sides and the tops and the ins and the outs, the next thing you know, you just had a hodgepodge of colors on every side. And I don't know about you, some people got really good at solving Rubik's Cubes. And they could take a cube and they could start doing their thing and working their magic, and the next thing you know, they had it all figured out. And I just was never that way. I like puzzles and things, but for some reason those things just confounded me, and I could not get those. I spent hours on them sometimes, could not get those to work. In fact, I think probably the only time I ever actually solved them was the time I took all the stickers off and stuck them back on in the right order, That was my best shot at getting it. But today they have Rubik's Cube competitions. To who can solve them the fastest. And in fact, I've seen little things on the internet where they have little Lego machines that you could put a Rubik's Cube in, and it'll solve the cube for you with a Lego. And it was like, how do they do this? I don't even know. The guys that do these in competition, it's like 2 seconds, 3 seconds, something like that to solve it. I can't even get one of the things rotated in that amount of time. And they're doing this, what it illustrates to me is, for somebody that's a master and can look at a hodgepodge mess of colors and shapes and how the different turns are supposed to go, and automatically know I need to do this, and this in order to make it all come out perfect. I kind of sit in amazement at something like that because I never could do it. But yet this is exactly what we're seeing that God is doing in the life of Paul and his ministry as they come to Corinth. He has this, not really all successful in terms of man's understanding ministry through this second missionary journey. He's had a lot of hardships. He's had a lot of opposition. He's had some jail time. He's had some beatings. He's had some real difficult arguments. He just came down from Mars Hill with the philosophers trying to explain to them about a God that they didn't even understand existed. He had a lot of moving parts. And yet when he gets to Corinth, all of a sudden it's like God puts all those little moving parts in place and it all comes together. And I want us to talk about that because so many times in our own lives, we feel like there's a hodgepodge of moving parts, that it's never going to work out, that we're going to spend the rest of our life just simply aimlessly, shifting and changing and moving, and it's never going to really be complete. And the truth is, God already has a plan. God already knows what parts and how all those things are going to line up, and He is already steps ahead of us in terms of His master solution. to the issues that we're dealing with in our lives. And so I want us to look at that this morning, because sometimes I think we need encouragement when life seems a little disarrayed. The first thing that we see, Paul begins in verse 1. It says, "After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome." First thing I want us to think about in terms of how God's plan works out for us is this, that sometimes God turns hard times into what's really an easy fit. Sometimes God turns hard times into an easy fit, because the truth is, what we see as difficulty, God may be using as an opportunity. Paul was in the midst of quite a bit of difficulties. And as he comes into Corinth, he runs into, just by coincidence, this couple that had some difficulties in their own life as well. Aquila and Priscilla. What we see here just in this verse 1 and 2 regarding Priscilla and Aquila, there's a lot underlying this that we don't maybe oftentimes take time to think about. But here was a man and a wife who were essentially evicted and chased out of Rome. They were essentially told, "You can't live here anymore. We don't want Jews in our city." This was what Claudius, who was one of the Roman rulers there, had done. He was pushing all of the Jews out of the city. The Jews were seen as people who were stirring up trouble. Of course, this was a number of years before the temple was about to be destroyed, but the Jews were considered to be rebels. They were considered to be groups that were stirring up opposition against Rome. And as a general whole, the Romans did not like the Jews. And so it had gotten to such a fever pitch at this point that Claudius decided, we're getting rid of the Jews out of Rome. We don't even want them in the city anymore. And this was how they lost their home, and they had to start over again, basically in Corinth. It said they had lately come from Italy. In other words, they hadn't left from Rome for very long. They hadn't had a lot of time, but they were kind of starting their life over again here in Corinth. And it says here, as a side note, these were tent makers, right? They were when we think about a tent maker, it's not like, they weren't doing camping tents, for Camping World or anything. This was awnings. They made awnings. They made types of heavy-duty weaving that they would have done, and the types of tents that people might have lived in that would have been, more substantial, a type of canvas or something to that effect. And so they were starting over. They had a business they had obviously lost back in Rome. They had lost their income. They had lost their home. They had to leave behind possibly their friends back in Rome. And they were being persecuted. They were being looked at as, well, you're a rebel rouser. We're sending you out of Rome because we don't want you anymore. And the Romans don't trust you. So now I'm trying to make business in a Roman world where people don't trust me and don't want me. That's a difficult place to be. And they were starting over here in Corinth. And as God had already orchestrated this, he made sure that they were in Corinth just before Paul arrived. Just in time for Paul to hit ground there in Corinth and begin his ministry. And interestingly enough, we know just from history and from other parts in the Bible, Aquila and Priscilla were, of course, very ready to hear the message of Christ. They were prepared spiritually. And so it says in verse 3, it says, because he was of the same craft, he abode with them, and he wrought or worked, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And so God takes this difficulty, not only in Paul's life, but in Priscilla and Aquila's life, and he begins to put them together to offer some help. And I think there's an interesting point here that we need to consider, and that's this, that while God often supplies the help that we need, we must continue to supply hard work. Paul just happened to be a tent maker too, right? Paul just happened to be someone who had the same craft, had the same trade that Priscilla and Aquila was. This is the first time we see Paul running into somebody who does the same thing he does. Just so happened that they were at Corinth. Just so happened that they were starting over. Just so happened that they were ready to receive the gospel. You see, Paul couldn't have planned this. This was God's plan altogether. God had help on the way for Paul, and he had help on the way for Priscilla and Aquila, all at the same time. But you notice, sometimes what do we end up with when we begin to think about God's sovereignty and God's plan for everything? You know, we have a danger that we can run into when we think about God's sovereignty in expression to our own responsibility. When we think about God's sovereignty, sometimes we think, well, God's got it all planned out. So, really, I don't have to do anything. Really, God's got it all planned out, so what does it even matter if I pray? God's got it all planned out, so what does it matter if I share the gospel? God's got it all planned out. Why do I have to do anything? I just sit back and ride the train. Well, you see, that's not how God ever has demonstrated how his sovereignty works in all of Scripture. There's always God working. There's always God behind the scenes. He, of course, sees the master plan. He, of course, knows every move that needs to be made in each one of our lives, and he is in control of those things. But nowhere does he say, you just sit back and ride. He always gives man a job to do. Think about it, even back in the Garden of Eden. What did he do with Adam? He put him in a perfect environment. He set him up in a completely perfect relationship with him. He had sovereignly enabled all of creation to kind of be subservient to him, to be helpful to him. And what does he say to Adam? Now, your job is to work the garden. Your job is to have a job to do here, right? You don't just sit here and pick apples from the tree all day, because you're going to have some work to do. You see, God always expects man to supply a component of work, not because we can add to anything in terms of his power or his sovereignty or his control in the situation, but because we need an investment in that work as well. We need an investment as mankind. And so this is where you see Paul. Paul, he says he was of the same craft, he lived with them, and he wrought, or the regular word we might use is he worked. He got a job. He says, Priscilla and Aquila, hey, I see you're tent makers, and you maybe need a little extra help this week. You think you could take me on as a little helper? And they said, sure, Paul, come on in. And they gave him a job, and he began to work. You know, there's nothing wrong with good old, hard, old-fashioned work. And he didn't allow that to interfere with his ministry. In fact, he says he was doing this work. He was doing this occupation, and probably it was hard work in the time, but it says in verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Paul came into this city unknown to him, obviously without a lot of money. If he had not needed the money, he would not be working, right? He was obviously had some problems where he needed some money, and we see later that was problem was solved when Silas came along. But here he was without much money in an unknown city, without a place to stay, and God had everything figured out ahead of time. You know, we need to remember God can turn even hard times, even unknown times, even the most difficult of times into something that we just fit right into. Because he's got a plan for each one of us. Let's look at the second thing. We see, secondly, that God can turn harsh opposition into an earnest following. Verse 5 and 6, it says, when Silas and Timothy were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles. So there's a lot going on here. Silas and Timothy were left behind, remember, and they were still catching up with Paul at this point in time. They come from Macedonia, and it says Paul was now pressed in the Spirit. And this is a difficult translation for us to understand, but the idea behind this word, pressed in the Spirit, means he was, at this point, able to be fully given to the work that God had for him. This is the idea behind this. He was conformed. He was constrained, is sometimes how it's translated. But it really is not about being having this compulsion, as much as it is about saying, I have now a full dedication to be able to do the work. In other words, they had come and they were able to bring him some funds. They brought some funds in from Macedonia so that he didn't have to detract from his work in the church with the work that he had to do to make tents. He was able to fully devote himself, in other words, to the work of the Spirit. That's the idea behind this. And so he was able to be fully devoted to that work. But then he says, just when he finally says, okay, now I can be full-time, I can be in the square every day, I can be in the marketplace, I can be in with the Jews, we can just go full out, all full bore, right, to get the gospel into this city. The very next sentence, we see, he testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ, and when they opposed themselves and blasphemed. Just when he got himself, okay, I got all four wheels in the ground, we're all going full steam ahead, and the next thing you know, the Jews are like, we're not listening to this anymore, Paul. They didn't agree amongst themselves about what Paul was saying, and they weren't agreeing with Paul, since they were opposing him, and they began to blaspheme God, and they got to the place where Paul recognized that his word was no longer going to be received there in the synagogue. And this is kind of the second thought about underneath this one, is sometimes we need wisdom to know when our witness is no longer effective. Sometimes we need wisdom. You know, Paul had gone from city to city to city, from synagogue to synagogue to synagogue, except with the exception of Philippi. Paul went to the synagogues, right? He went from place to place to place. And this was his mode. And yes, he didn't always make everybody happy, but it hadn't ever gotten to this place before. To the place where he realized, I'm not going to make any more progress here. There's not going to be any more work that I can do. And so he says he shook his raiment and he said to them, your blood be upon your own hands, for I am clean. He's basically saying to them, I've done my best to explain this to you. I've done my best to declare Christ. And I can see that it's a brick wall that I'm not getting past. He's not saying, I'm giving up on you, or I don't care about you, or that he wouldn't talk to the Jews anymore. He's saying, I recognize my ministry will be more effective in a different place. And he had the wisdom to realize this when things got hostile against him in the synagogue. You know, Jesus says something about this. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 6. Jesus said, give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you. And I say, this needs wisdom because, sometimes we can just get mad, right? Well, they're not listening to me and I'm just mad about it, so I'm just not going to talk to them about Christ anymore. Well, that might be God's leading, but did you really get God's wisdom in it? Do you know really what you're doing? I mean, we need a lot of wisdom and discernment about when to say, hey, this is no longer an opportunity. But the other side of it is just as true. Should we continue to put effort and energy and investment into people and relationships that we see no evidence that they're ever going to change in? And allow ourselves to continue to be frustrated and to continue to be stymied by their reaction? And the answer is no. There comes a point where we need the wisdom to say it's time to walk away and let just God work in their heart. Because again, who's in control? It's God. He's the one that's got to work in hearts. And so this is what he did in verse 7, an interesting turn of events. He says he departed thence. He entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshiped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. Okay, so this is like, the row houses, right? Where like the one wall, there's a brick wall, and the other one goes right up against it. All you city people, right? You understand this. I'm a country person, right? And some of you understand country people, right? To me, I like my neighbor to be unseen, right? I like to be able to go out in the front or go out in the back and say, yeah, I have a neighbor. He lives on the other side of that hill, right? There's a neighbor there, and he's far enough away that I can't see him, right? And that's what country life's about to me. But when you live in the city, and I don't even understand this, but there's houses that are built right next to, you can't even walk between them, right? They are hard up against each other. They're door-to-door neighbors. I mean, you knock on the side wall, they're probably knocking back. I don't know how that works, but That's to me, that's a scary prospect. I don't want a neighbor that close, you know. But this was the idea. This is what's being told to us about Paul and Justus and the synagogue. So Justus had this house, and he was the next door neighbor to the synagogue, hard up against it. And Paul says, well, if you folks in the synagogue won't listen to me, I'm going to go next door and start the church. This is essentially what's happening. Remember, he's still staying with Aquila and Priscilla. Why did he go to Justus's house? Because this was where the church was going to meet. This was the place. This was the meeting place for the church, at least for right away. And it made a lot of sense because now all of the Jews that he had convinced, right, that Jesus was the Christ. Well, I'm on my way to synagogue this morning, and he puts the sign out right next door. Hey, if you believe in Christ, come in this door. And you're synagogue people, you go in that door. This was what was going on. Now, that's a little offensive, right? If I was the guy in charge of the synagogue, I'd be doing what I could to get rid of Paul. Because, you know, that's just like in your face. This was what Paul was doing. But this is the idea. But here again, was God working this out? There just happened to be a guy named Justus who just happened to accept Christ, who just happened to live right next door to the synagogue, who just happened to have space in his house to have people meet and have a church meeting there. No. God's already been working the plan, right? He already had this figured out. And I think Paul knew that. And so that's why he went to this man's house. And then interestingly enough, things get worse for the folks in the synagogue. Verse 8. It says, Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all of his house, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. And then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by the vision, Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months. That's our second point this morning under this one, is we can't let disappointments discourage us from sharing our faith with others. You can't let the disappointments in life bring you to the place where I'm just too discouraged. You know, Paul had to have been discouraged. He presented Christ. He presented the truth. He's been working hard. He's been doing his best, right? And then these people literally shut him out. And the next thing you know, he's got to go next door. He's got to be in the middle of another big uproar, another big bunch of hostility. And he could have very easily gotten discouraged. The next thing you know, the guy who's in charge of the synagogue, the chief ruler, Crispus, he comes to Christ. This was a certain change of events that maybe Paul never saw. But here he comes to the faith. His whole house comes to the faith. They get baptized. It said, then many of the Corinthians, many people in the city begin to come to the faith. And then Paul is confirmed through this vision that there's many more that God has for his church there to build it. And he says that Paul is going to be kept safe through it all. And this was unlike, by the way, what he had experienced in other cities that he had just been through. And so what do we see? Paul gets to this discouraged place, and then he gets encouragement because the tide begins to turn. God had again orchestrated all this to happen. And Paul continues to work at the church with this team of fellow believers. He has Justus now. He has Aquila. He has Priscilla. He has Timothy. He has Silas, possibly Luke, possibly some others, and certainly many in Corinth. And how long does he stay there? For 1.5 years. Do you realize this is the longest church that Paul has ever worked at? This is the longest city that he's been able to stay in. He really gets to establish himself there in Corinth and be able to establish teaching and to establish leadership and to deal with, many of the issues we see. Of course, if you read the books of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd, you realize how many problems they had at the church in Corinth. So maybe he spent a lot of that time trying to sort out problems. But the truth is, Paul writes then to Corinth. Paul establishes the church at Corinth. And he does this because God had everything put right in place. And I think there's an interesting point for us, is that sometimes we may not see anything coming into place. We may see things but falling apart in our life. We may see, nothing but disarray. And God can just make that one more turn. And the next thing you know, everything lines up. That's the God that we serve. Things happen exactly as God plans. Let's look at the third point then this morning. That God can turn a hopeless situation into a great expansion of the faith. It says in verses 12 and 13, of course, the Jews are still not happy with him. And it says, when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, he's basically the governor of the state or the region in which Corinth was in, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul. They all got together. They brought him to the judgment seat. He's been to the judgment seat before, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. Now, like I said, Paul's been through this round before, right? How many times has Paul been brought before the judgment seat? How many times have the Jews gone to the authorities and tried to accuse Paul of something that he was doing wrong in terms of his ministry? And again, this could have been, Paul was like, okay, my ministry's over. It's all done. I got a year and a half in. That's been a good run. Now I'm going to end up in prison again, getting beaten, because that's what happened in every instance before that, right? Well, here's what we see. Point is this: historical precedence doesn't dictate God's current possibilities. Sometimes we begin to think, well, this is how it's always happened. Every time this has happened to me before, it's always turned out this way. Every time, I've gone through this trial, this is how it's always come out in the end. I've always come out with the short stick. And there is a certain, again, wisdom that we need to know how many times we keep putting ourselves through difficult situations. But we can't just presume that historical precedent means things are always going to turn out the same, because this may be the time God has a different plan. And that's certainly true here. Here's Paul brought before that Roman judge. The same types of charges are laid against him. He's been through this before. And he went to Philippi, if you remember that. Acts 16, they brought him to the magistrates, and they said to the magistrates, he teaches customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. It's the same exact charge they're making here. What happened to him there? He was beaten. He was sent to prison, right? Then he went to Thessalonica. And they couldn't find Paul at this one. And so then they took Jason there. And what did they say there in Acts chapter 17? It said, these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. That's what they said at Thessalonica. Well, Jason got in trouble for that. And the next thing you know, who had to stand for trial and he had to pay bond to get out of jail. The authorities basically ruled against him. Berea, they came there and they tried to do the same thing. Paul left before they could bring him before the judgment seat in Berea. But time and time again, it's the same argument that's being made, the same case that's being made. And in three different other instances that we just saw in this very journey over the last few months, Paul had seen the same verdict turn out badly for him. And so, it says in verse 14, Paul was about to open his mouth. Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wickedness or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. So here, Paul doesn't even have to put up a defense. Very unexpected circumstance. Paul put up his defense in the others, and he lost. Right? He made his best argument, and he lost. Here, Paul doesn't even have to put up the argument. And Gallio sees right through it. He says, you know what? This isn't Roman rule. This is trumped up charges. These things aren't really have anything to do with Roman law whatsoever. This is the fact that you don't like what he's saying. That's essentially what Gallio says. You don't like the word that he's preaching. You don't like how he's taking converts from your synagogue. You don't like whatever it is that he's representing here before you. He says, but it has nothing to do with Roman law. It has to do with the fact that you just don't like this guy anymore. And I don't want to hear it. And he says, you're wasting the court's time, is essentially what he's saying. And he says, I'm annoyed with you, so much so that he says, I'm driving you out from the judgment seat. Right? He doesn't just dismiss the trial. He says, and don't waste my time again. And he gets the guards, whoever they are, and he begins to drive these Jews out from the judgment seat. And then it says in verse 17, before we get to that, we see, why does God intervene? Why does God intervene in this particular sense? Well, God intervenes to establish his kingdom. We're going to see this because this is what happens next. It says, all the Greeks took Sosthenes, that's a hard one, Sosthenes, and he was the chief ruler of the synagogue. Okay, think about this. We just heard about the chief ruler of the synagogue. His name was Crispus, right? Well, now it's been a year and a half. Paul had been working there in Corinth. They had time to elect another chief ruler of the synagogue. The next guy that comes up is Sosthenes, right? And it says he's the chief ruler of the synagogue. He was likely the guy who would have brought the charges. He would have been the lead prosecutor, if you will, against Paul in that day. He would have been the one who brought these things to the judgment seat. And so what does it say? The Greeks took him and they beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of these things. He just looked the other way. He's like, just to make sure that you know that I don't really care that you're getting beat up. He says, I didn't see that, right? It's all happening in front of him. But he's like, I didn't see that, right? I'm blind. He turns a blind eye to what's going on with Sosthenes. All of the Greeks who were annoyed with the Jews that had come in and made these charges and wasted the governor's time, they begin to beat up Sosthenes and they chase him out of the judgment seat as part of this driving him out. And so here, you see the change of events? Paul came in with a certain doom and gloom. There was a certain surety that he was going to lose the case because he's lost everyone he's been to before, right? He gets to a judge that has some sense about him and makes the right ruling. And the next thing you know, instead of Paul being beaten and jailed, the lead prosecutor gets beaten and shoved out of the judgment hall. This is a big change of events. But interestingly enough, what else do we know about Sosthenes? Do you know his name comes up later in Scripture as well? Sosthenes comes up in 1 Corinthians 1:1. The very first verse of the very first epistle that we have written to the Corinthians, Paul writes this, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. Paul had, through all of this, been able to share Christ with this guy who was the lead prosecutor against his case. The guy who was another chief ruler of the synagogue. And just like Crispus, apparently Sosthenes came to the faith. And maybe by this time, because he is writing to the Corinthian church, maybe he was a leader in the church. He may have been one of the early pastors there at Corinth. And Sosthenes came from being beaten for the cause of Christ unknowingly to being leading the church there in Corinth. Now, could Paul have figured that out? Could Paul have made all that happen? No, there's a God behind it. A God who was pulling the strings. A God who saw all of the variations and the variables and knew which ways to turn to make everything fit together. He knew he wanted Sosthenes to come to the faith. He knew there wanted to be a church established there in Corinth. He knew he needed Paul there for a year and a half. He knew he needed to provide for Paul's funding. He knew that Paul wasn't going to be placed in prison. He needed that confidence to share his faith across Corinth. All of these things God already knew. And God made it all work out according to his plan. You see, this verdict was now a positive development for the church at Corinth. I don't know if you've thought about this, but think about every other place that Paul was sometimes only there for a few weeks before he got chased out of town, right? What does that mean for the rest of the believers that were left? Well, they were left under a state of persecution as well. Because now the leader that just led them all to the faith, he was chased out of town. There was now a lot of hostility in the city against the believers. Corinth now didn't experience that, because the governor of the land just gave him his little umbrella of protection. He just told the Jews, you don't have any case. So don't get out of my sight. So now the church kind of had this little umbrella protection from the Roman government in Corinth. The believers would not face the same types of legal threats and persecution that those other churches would have been facing. And as a result, the church in Corinth flourished. Verse 18 and 19, it says, after Paul after this, he tarried there yet a good while. He took his leave of the brethren, and he sailed thence into Syria. And with him, Priscilla and Aquila, the tent makers. the ones who had just recently left Rome, the ones who had taken Paul into their home. By this point, a year and a half, 2 years later, they realized their calling was greater than just to make tents in Corinth. And we see a Priscilla and Aquila popping up different other places in Scripture, and eventually even back in Rome, where they would continue to assist and build in the work of the ministry and the work of the church. Priscilla and Aquila. And so God not only gives Paul this nice little stopover in Corinth, but now he enlarges the team that can go out and do even more work to be more effective at reaching the known world at the time for Christ. Paul brings Aquila and Priscilla with him to Ephesus, and there they would be left behind to establish the church there and go on to help in other churches as well. We know from some of the other letters that they actually have the church in their home in some of these places until they establish church buildings. And so all of this happens exactly as God planned. So the question I have as we close this morning is this: what is it that you have doubts about? Where is it that you have confusion? You sometimes feel like the circumstances in your life look like that Rubik's Cube. The dots don't ever seem to line up. You don't know what to do. You keep turning the dial, keep doing this, keep doing that, and you're frustrated. And you feel like it's never going to turn out. And I've tried everything I can and it hasn't worked. Do you realize sometimes God just wants us to turn around and say, Lord, I'm trusting you. Lord, I'm placing this in your hands. You're the master behind it. You're the creator of all things. You're the one who's all-powerful. In the midst of our frustrations, in the midst of our troubles, what's the first thing we forget about? The fact that God's all-knowing, the fact that God's all-powerful, and the fact that God's omnipresent. The three key qualities that we know about God, those are the first three that we seem to forget when our circumstances and our situations in life seem to be against us and seem not to be aligned and seem to never work out the way we had hoped and planned. We need to sometimes step back and say, I don't understand this. I don't understand why you brought me here or why you put this into my life. I don't understand what's going on, but I choose to trust you. That's the difference. That comes back to our faith. Who is your God to you? How big is he? Do you believe the things that you proclaim about him? Because if you do, then your trust will be wholeheartedly based on the truth that you believe. Everything will turn out exactly as God plans it to be. And that's the best way we can have it to turn out, right? None of us in the end wants our situations to turn out the way we plan them. Well, we might, selfishly. But the truth is, every one of us will only truly get satisfaction and give God glory in the end when things in our life turn out exactly as he plans.